line which usually gets a big laugh, but okay, but it's not. Feel free to laugh. Globalization is everything and its opposite. And Friedman is pointing out the fact that globalization is an all-encompassing, again, very abstract concept, but there are also countervailing forces that keep globalization from making us quite one world. He's talking, for example, about identity politics, where people reaffirm their basic identities, whether that's religious, ethnic, cultural, racial, etc. And these countervailing tendencies are sometimes captured by a word that Friedman also uses, the word that does not go through spell check. It's the word globalization. Globalization. There's a local element to globalization. People are reaffirming that they do live in a special place, that we don't want the whole world to be kind of one big mall where all the outlets are the same Gap and other stores that you see everywhere. So there's a reaffirmation of local identity. So there you have it, 3 definitions that are somewhat abstract of globalization. To make it more vivid, let me just share with you 6 brief vignettes from my own life, interesting as it is, which have reminded me of globalization in recent weeks. First, I recently walked by a factory in the home area. I grew up in Queens, New York. You can't tell from my accent by now. And I recently walked by, not far from my parents' house, they're still in the same old house 40, 50 years later, and there was a factory there. It was there for years. I used to walk by on the way to school back in the 60s and 70s. Now it's closed. And I asked people in the neighborhood, well, what's the reason for this? And they used 2 words, outsourcing and offshoring. And you probably know these words if you read the daily paper. Outsourcing, by which many companies send parts or part of their production offshore. For example, if you call up the Dell computer company, you will get the person in Bangalore, India answering the phone. And they usually do a very good job, but it's nowhere near where you are. That's outsourcing. Moving some of your local production off somewhere else. And then offshoring, where entire companies pick up and move somewhere else. There's a documentary about 3 years ago called Life and Debt. It was all about third world debt and this kind of rapid mobility of capital in the world. And it featured a factory in Kingston, Jamaica. It's the free trade zone down in the harbor area of Kingston, Jamaica. Well, when I saw this documentary about this factory, I said, wait a minute, I've been there. And it's one of the places that my Jesuit superiors sent me over 20 years ago. And overnight, that textile factory, where people would come in and use sewing machines, kind of low-tech enterprise, it had picked up and moved somewhere else, I suspect to Honduras or El Salvador, where the wages were even lower. So the rapid movement of factories, offshoring and outsourcing, is the first phase of globalization. And any of you who have come from the part of our country affectionately known as the Rust Belt will know exactly what I mean by this. And I suspect some of the Silicon Valley that you're probably more familiar with out here also has been experiencing this sending abroad or offshore of production. The second vignette. Investors today, at least I understand, I'm not much of an investor myself, investors today are able to transfer their portfolios into various parts of the world with simply the click of a computer mouse. I didn't know that until I read Thomas Friedman's book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. Simply by looking at a computer screen, seeing some opportunities, rates of return, perhaps in Indonesia or someplace where the wages are low, people are able to send their investment dollars, their portfolios, their accounts, to distant places, places that you may never have been able to pronounce or even heard of before. This is one of the faces of globalization. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, perhaps it's a good thing. It gives you flexibility as an investor. You can maximize your rate of return. It could be a bad thing because, as we just saw, it could mean the closing of factories here in the United States, the destruction of communities. You get the sense already. I've only been through 2 of my 6 vignettes. Already, globalization is a two-faced or even a two-sword, the 2 edges of a sword phenomenon. There are good things about it and potentially bad things about it. Third vignette, I call this my tomato vignette. I live in the cold Northeast where I understand a snowstorm has just rendered my city of Boston paralyzed. I hope I can land when my flight takes off tomorrow. Well, we don't get much in the way of fruit during the winter, or at least we didn't used to. These days, fruits, vegetables, I'm especially fond of the midwinter tomato that used to be so rare, are much more available. Increases in transportation, great progress in the way that fruits and vegetables are moved from place to place, now mean that if Chile is having a good year in tomato, then Chile is what, 11,000 miles away or something? We can benefit from that. That if, no matter where the crops are produced, people even in cold, frigid zones like where I live in the Northeast can benefit from it. So there's a positive part of globalization. Fourth item. This comes from my brother-in-law, who recently purchased a Ford Escort. It's not a great car, sorry, but it's all he could afford. But he took pride in his Ford Escort and went to read the owner's manual, and he was looking at the parts, the components of the Ford Escort, and he discovered that the parts of his Escort were assembled in 15 different countries. The catalytic converter came from one place, the engine came from Mexico, the hood came from who knows where. All products now are hybrids. They come from different parts of the world. And I suspect the last appliance that you bought, whether it was a computer, a refrigerator, or a car, any of these durable goods, as they call them, are produced in many places. They're all the results of multinational corporations, or sometimes called transnational corporations, that take advantage of the lowest labor, the lowest supply costs, and produce things in many places and assemble them in a diverse set of locations, no longer simply in one place like Detroit, Michigan. Fifth vignette, September 11th, attack that destroyed a significant chunk of my home city. I used to walk through the World Trade Center all the time. My sister lived about 3 blocks from there. Luckily, she wasn't even there at the time. You all remember the fear, the horror that you experienced on September 11th, 2001. International terrorism can be viewed, in one lens anyway, as a phenomenon of globalization. People can travel from place to place. You know, in the case of the terrorists, they can learn how to fly in different parts of the world. Borders are more permeable. There's really no way, there's no possibility of keeping people totally out from any part of the world, to exclude, for example, all people from the Middle East in the United States. Borders are permeable. International terrorism is one of the faces, perhaps the very scariest face, of globalization. We are all more vulnerable today to people who would wish us ill. And that's just one of the faces of globalization. Sixth and finally, it's also kind of on the negative side, diseases. Diseases now cross borders more easily than ever before. And so the AIDS epidemic is not just in one country or one part of the world. People bring it from place to place. I remember the fear of mad cow disease a few months or years ago. It's still going on, actually. It's affected beef imports and exports around the world. Maybe on the West Coast you're more aware of a series of diseases like SARS and Asian avian flu and a bunch of other diseases that happen from time to time, various flus, infectious diseases. Viruses travel just as fast as information, or money, or people, or goods. Those are just some vignettes. I'm sure that each one of you could think of 5, 10, or 20 vignettes in your own life by which you have been affected and touched by globalization. I suspect that in your own thoughts, you too can pick out positives and negatives. Some benefits that we make, perhaps financial benefits, or just the benefit of being exposed to more cultures, of living in an exciting city like San Francisco, where there's so much ethnic mixing and different cultures coming into contact. It's wonderful to be part of the Pacific Rim, I'm sure. But on the other hand, you're probably also aware of enhanced vulnerabilities, whether to terrorism, whether to diseases, whether to just uncertainty about the future of your economy and the future that is very much a vulnerable and risky thing about the future. My summary of all this material on the definition of globalization is simply this. Globalization is inevitably about relationships. Some of them are human relationships, people you might have contact with when you travel. That's another benefit of globalization, being kind of a tourist or a global traveler. It's a wonderful thing. But some of those relationships go deeper than just face-to-face. Some of them are more systematic, and they involve social responsibility.